Hello, my name is Tammy Schneider, and I am a founding board member of the National Museum of American Religion. We don't have an exhibit yet, we don't have a building yet, but with your help, after tonight's program, we will have a virtual museum up and going. Tonight, we welcome you to see the kinds of things that we can do with a museum dedicated to the notion of the role that the freedom of religion in the United States of America has had over time till today and will always have moving forward in the future. What we have for you right now is a piece entitled Lincoln Tribute by the Piano Guys, then a short film entitled The Prayers of Both Could Not Be Answered. And we will end with another beautiful music video entitled Free at Last Medley with Condoleezza Rice and Jenny Oakes Baker. The National Museum of American Religion seeks to be a place where the issues around freedom of religion in this country can be examined from numerous perspectives. In fact, there's not a single perspective from which we do not want to examine it. And that's the beauty of tonight's program. It is a way of looking at Lincoln's second inaugural address to talk about the issues that were faced in the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, and even how the ramifications of those actions are being grappled with even today. A place where we want all views and all perspectives to examine this question of what happens to a place like the United States of America when you have freedom of religion as a basic essential premise. What we are hoping to do with this video is to so entice you to the work of what the museum can be that you will become friends of the museum and donate so that we can have our first virtual exhibits up and running by next summer.
A difficult question, roiling much of our culture today, is how do we understand 18th or 19th century people? The letters and diaries of people who were there that day indicate that people were angry. Every person there had probably lost a father, a husband, a son, a brother. They were surprised when Lincoln did not speak in anger. He did not speak in triumph, and he did not crow about himself. But actually, this speech was about forgiveness and reconciliation. He was thinking forward, how can this nation come together once more? And that's the genius of this speech.
At this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. Then a statement, somewhat in detail, of a course to be pursued seemed fitting and proper, called forth on every point and phase of the great contest which still absorbs the attention and engrosses the energies of the nation. Little that is new could be presented.
It was only 4 weeks before the end of the Civil War. Lincoln had just been re-elected. He understood that the bitter war was coming to a close. 2 years ago, he emancipated the slaves. And only 4 years earlier, the nation had fallen into bitter violence and endless bloodshed. For this, his second inaugural address, the North was expecting strong words of rational catharsis, and the South was expecting further offenses to aggravate the already mounting and unbearable defeat on the battlefield. And yet, he gave them neither. In the furnace of the Civil War's affliction, he hammered together his cold reasoning with biblical teachings in order to inspire purpose in the bloodshed of this cataclysmic war, so to continue the life of the Union in spite of the divisions that wrought so heavily upon the nation.
It is a presidential inaugural address during a time of war to talk about bringing the nation together, while also saying that the thing that has rended the nation is something that Lincoln disagrees with.
He's juggling several things. The war ain't over yet, and yet it's close. The 13th Amendment has made it through Congress. He's got to bring about reestablishment of the total Union so as not to have Southern generals' heads sitting on pikes. It could have easily gone medieval and been, in his read of the way God deals with God's people, justified if God were to just allow the bloodshed to continue.
Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. And the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not that we be not judged.
This is where he does well to appeal to this Christocentric consciousness that was pervasive in the land, even among Christian slaveholders who still felt justified holding people of African descent in bondage.
He's saying, how can you even believe that it's okay to enslave other persons and benefit from their labor without any benefit to them. All of that is framed in religious language and his understanding of God and what God's worth is.
When we get to 1865 in the second inaugural address, he's still trying to leave the door cracked for the South. Lincoln always does that, leaving the light on for the Southerners, okay? That's what he's doing. Even as he's saying, but you all have been gone for a long time and you're really far away.
Totally unknown to the crowd that day was something that Lincoln had written for himself 2.5 years earlier. He had the habit of writing little notes. He didn't title them, he didn't date them, he didn't sign them. His young secretary, John Hay, found it after his death and gave it a title, Meditation on the Divine Will. And here Lincoln is saying both sides claim to be acting on behalf of God. People were coming to him, ministers and politicians, to say God is on our side. But he knew people were coming to Jefferson Davis to say God is on our side. And Lincoln, in that remarkable meditation, says it may be that God's purpose is different from the purpose of either side. And so when Lincoln says in the second inaugural, the Almighty has his own purposes, on the one hand, he's declaring God acts in history. But on the other hand, in humility, he is not saying, I know exactly what those purposes are.
It's a very well done, very complicated piece of writing. Say what you want, he was a phenomenal writer. I mean, good grief, he could write.
Most historians, most experts, most political scientists, if you look at any poll I have ever seen, including the ones I participated in, there are always 3 presidents that stand head and shoulders above the rest, literally head and shoulders. Nobody's close to them. And that's Washington, Lincoln, and FDR. And Lincoln was different than those other 2.
Many of our previous presidents up to him were people who came from large slave-owning, land-owning families. Lincoln's family were squatters. They were people who really did not have anything.
People who viewed Lincoln as wrong for the job probably looked at this gangly, not very attractive man who had before been just a congressman. How dare he?
A lot of Southerners like to paint Lincoln as a joke, and they felt like he was. To not be from the plantocracy, just think about someone ascending to be the Queen of England who never was a part of the aristocratic world. The noses that would turn up in the air at that person, I don't care what status they hold, and that's how Lincoln was treated, especially by people like Jefferson Davis, who, this is West Point trained golden boy, who, I mean, seriously, that's who he is. From this aristocratic slave-holding family who is looking at Lincoln and saying, who are you? And that's what they all were saying. He was an upstart in their minds.
Here comes this hardscrabble guy who becomes president of the United States and is confronted with this moment when the country is going to be torn apart.
A typical president joins the Masons, joins the various different associations and clubs, beginning with George Washington. They were natural joiners. He was, in fact, in a way, sort of the opposite of a joiner. He was so much an individual. That's why he didn't join churches. That's why he didn't join clubs. He didn't even remain very well affiliated with the Whig Party, for which he was a member of Congress. He had a mind of his own. Think of his own pick of Andrew Johnson as his second vice president, not even a member of his own party.
He's polarizing, so people want to ascribe very bad attributes to take down the good and vice versa. But if you look at him as a person, he's like a first-generation college student because he did not have people to say, this is how we do it. He's sort of trying to learn on the job constantly.
Another issue is what he actually thought of black people. If he thought, what are you going to do with those enslaved black people once they're free? You can say, well, he had to end slavery in the territories first. Those might have been purely political statements, and Lincoln was always, in addition to be a deep thinker, he was also a good politician. We know his relationship with a person like Frederick Douglass, a former slave, but those are issues that historians grapple with, and people raise, well, was he just for ending slavery, or did he truly believe in racial equality? You can't really tell. Is he being political when he's talking? I don't know.
It reminds me of Frederick Douglass and his early years where he saw the pre-13th Amendment Constitution as a prima facie pro-slavery document. And then he changes to seeing the Constitution as an anti-slavery document. How does he do that? Because he starts to think critically about the preamble to the Constitution, we the people. And he extracts from that ferment an idea that if that is the preamble to the Constitution, then the Constitution itself has to align with the notion that we the people includes all people. And therefore, if the Constitution starts that way, then the Constitution itself has to be an anti-slavery document, no matter, and here's the catch, no matter what the intention of the framers of the Constitution was. It's almost like they're the ones who messed up by infusing this document with one simple set of words that set the course for the entire document itself as being anti-slavery.
Lincoln tried to salvage the Constitution as a working document that was not tied to slavery. And so he explained in the last of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he said that the reason why the founders never used the word slavery in the Constitution, even though they used things that meant exactly the same thing, they avoided the word slavery or the word slaves or enslaved people. And he said that was because when this Constitution continues into generations long after slavery was abolished, there would be no blotch on the Constitution, that people could still use it and could still read it because that blotch wouldn't be there.
When you think about the original founding fathers at the end of the 18th century, they founded a remarkable set of institutions based on remarkable ideas about self-governance, about the equality of all human beings. But they found it with a birth defect of slavery. And so in many ways, Abraham Lincoln was the beginning of the second founding of the country, to erase the scourge of slavery, which could never have really been consistent with the brave ideals that were put forth in the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution.
What drove him into the election was the Dred Scott decision. A reading of the Constitution that declared that under the Constitution, Congress couldn't do anything to limit slavery in the territories, couldn't even do anything to really limit slavery, and Lincoln just didn't believe that.
By all accounts, Frederick Douglass was critical of Lincoln's outwardly soft approach to abolition. After their face-to-face encounters, Douglass ultimately concluded Lincoln as emphatically the black man's president, the first to show any respect for their rights. Douglass became a trusted advisor to Lincoln. There was at least one man who was not angered by the second inaugural address. As a stunned Douglass wrote thereafter, it sounded more like a sermon than a state paper. Lincoln, upon seeing Douglass in the throng that day, indicated there's no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours, to which Douglass replied, that was a sacred effort.
I think he is one of the few presidents who, as he thinks about and engages and listens to people, he's willing to make policy shifts, which is a really admirable trait when you think about kind of the history of politicians in the United States. Part of the difficulty of figuring out where Lincoln lands is he has a lot of dogs in the proverbial fight, so he's thinking in terms of military strategy, he's thinking in terms of political strategy. I'm walking on eggshells because I don't want to overstate his shifts in his views, but I also don't want to diminish the fact that he really was extraordinary in some ways.
Many historians also refer to Lincoln in this way as a later day founder, that there are the founders, the Franklin, Washington, Jefferson, Adams, and then there's Lincoln.
By 1865, Lincoln, I think, has realized that his goal of trying to extend these constant olive branches to the South as a solve for the end of slavery is not necessarily going to succeed in the way that he has hoped.
And then go through a horrific war, a more horrific war than the United States ever went through. And we're talking about percentages of deaths and how many homes it reached and how many people lost sons or cousins or friends. We have nothing similar. Battles like Shiloh, Gettysburg, Antietam, which were just the killing fields. It was a unique and deeply traumatic experience. Just vast numbers. People could see it intimately because you had Matthew Brady out there taking pictures. And you just have a whole field of dead Union soldiers or dead Confederate soldiers. And they were all somebody's son, somebody's brother, somebody's husband. And Lincoln felt it deeply, signing all those letters to the next of kin, facing that sort of experience. That was tremendously painful. You can see it in pictures. Lincoln, when he took office, and what he looked like when it ended. What those 4 years did to that man. It was unimaginably draining.
He has shifted somewhat by this point in the war because of the loss of faith in what can happen with the South, and also a softening in his views towards African Americans, and a recognition of their contributions to the war, because African Americans are also serving in the war. When we're talking about the front lines, they're dying, and that has an effect upon Lincoln.
So what were the views of the African American, of Abraham Lincoln? Like how did they view him at the time?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, there's going to be a range of views because there is no one African-American view. I think we tend to understand enslaved people as this kind of one group of people, not these amazingly complex individuals who occupy very different locations in society. So you'll have people who are literate, who are reading the papers, and who understand the nuances of what's happening, who will have one view of Lincoln as someone who is, despite his motivations, changing policies that have material effects upon African-descended people. And these material effects, like emancipation, are policy changes, complete about-faces in how the U.S. operates as a nation that people have been advocating for a very, very long time. Harriet Tubman, who is going to be a spy for the Union, who's leading people out of slavery, who has very little patience for politics, is going to say Lincoln is just another domino in this grand political scheme against us. So we can't trust any politician, is where people like Harriet Tubman will send. I think those of us who are slavery historians, if you understand how monumentally invested in slavery our nation was, I don't care where you are, this nation relied upon that system.
The two sides were not at all reconciled. Reading this speech does whatever it can in one speech to draw people together. Now, the South wasn't really ready to be brought together, but if they read the speech with understanding, they realized that this was as compassionate a leader as they could hope for after what they went through.
And so, when the day came, And as the war raged on to its fateful ending, the expectations were high. As a fever pitch of frustration wrangled through the crowd, it was palpable.
1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union, even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully.
He's using the language of Christianity to shift the Southern consciousness about what this war meant. In the South, they felt like their victory was going to be an affirmation of the divine recognition of slavery as a natural form of human organization. This hierarchy is divinely ordained. When you read the rhetoric, there was no question that the South would win. It never crossed their minds that they could actually lose the war. Now, of course, it crossed the soldiers' minds. The soldiers start deserting very early. It's a little known fact about the Confederacy. They had a high number of desertions because a lot of these people realized, hey, we're not slaveholders. And we're out here sacrificing our lives while slaveholders can send one of their enslaved people in their places. Their sons will go out there and fight, but they're also sending substitutes out there.
Whether or not Lincoln was articulating his own belief in the moment, he was appealing to the Christianized consciousness of a nation that said, you're doing wrong, and God sees it, and God has allowed it for whatever divine reason over a period of time. And now God just seeks to reckon with it because it is an offense to God. And I think we're still reckoning with that imperfect nature of this union.
For it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came.
He's saying that God is just, no matter what. And if we understand this war as God's justice for the centuries of slavery and for what this nation has been, then hopefully we can accept it better and move forward.
For the enslaver, it was about what God, by way of manifest destiny, had empowered them to do in this land, in part to enslave people of African descent, to grow and reap a great benefit financially from enslavement. But what enslaved people, once converting to Christianity, would do, they also felt empowered by that same God to withstand the empowered sovereign position of the slave master.
It became illegal in some states for Africans to practice their indigenous traditions, and persons who were enslavers also used Christianity as a way of seeking to make persons more docile, so there was the requirement to attend meetings with preachers who were using Christianity as a way that was affirming enslavement. But human beings are meant to be free, to be themselves. And so there was always this other interpretation going on.
Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away.
Fondly do we hope and fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. So poetic, it even rhymes. But then he goes on to say, yet, if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled up by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, that if it has to go on until all that money that has been piled up and accumulated shall be sunk. And he continues, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn by the sword. This notion that you can have an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful, right? Benevolent, sovereign, omnipotent God that would allow for enslavement to happen, to take place for over 250 years. And here he inserts it saying, I hope that God won't allow the payment for slavery to be more bloodshed, but I'm giving space that the way God deals with us may very well require that for every amount of piled up money that has come at the hand of the lash on the back of those enslaved, may require an equal amount of death on battlefields.
I hope you've been enjoying the film thus far. While I'm a scholar of religion, this is not my time period and this is not my specialization, but even I can see from my vantage point how the issues raised in Lincoln's second inaugural address impact everything that is happening today in our modern conversations about the Constitution, what's in, what's out, and how do we as a unified nation muddle through, carry on when the prayers of both cannot be answered. Where are those dividing lines and how does religion impact them and who wins those discussions? If the issues raised and the topics discussed have intrigued you, as we hope they have, please click on the button below, which will take you to a link where you can become a member, a friend of the National Museum of American Religion and make a monthly contribution or make a contribution now. We need your help to make this happen and to create this unique space that will focus on this very unique aspect of both the United States of America with this notion of freedom of religion, as well as the impact that freedom of religion has had going back out towards other religious communities around the world. Please join us and be a part of the National Museum of American Religion and donate today. With your help, we can write a new conversation about our history. Our goal is to raise $975,000 over the next year. It's huge, it's big, it's bold. Will you commit to a monthly donation of $250 over the next year? The link to donate is below.
Conventional study of religion is that most Americans who reject God do it on the problem of evil. They can't believe a God would allow this much evil in the world, and therefore they don't accept religion. That's an old issue. But it's certainly very true in America today. And I think Lincoln may have gone through that with the war, but then the war goes so far beyond the suffering. It gets so profound and deep, even that answer doesn't suffice. And you're forced to come to grips of what in the world is this all about? At first, it sort of alienated him to God, but as he went through the suffering and the death and the incredible profundity of the war, it makes him more spiritual than he ever was.
He's not saying that the debt up to that point had been paid on the battlefields. What he's saying is, I hope that the debt doesn't have to be paid in that manner. "41 days before his assassination.
As was said 3,000 years ago, so still must it be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right."
Perhaps he was wrong for the job and what we would have expected an American president to look like in those days, but he was right for the job because when it came right down to it, he didn't give up on America's promise, and he was determined to do whatever he had to do to defend it.
We need to understand that Lincoln is a 19th century person and appreciate that fact. He's not dealing with some of the issues that we deal with. But on the other hand, I would argue that he's a transcendent figure, that when he calls for malice toward none with charity for all, those are words that we can invoke today. He's a model of what it means to be magnanimous towards those with whom he disagrees.
And there are some who say, well, he came late to the end of slavery as a rationale for the war. I don't care if he came to it late. He came to it, and he delivered on it. And it's also the case that we have to wonder if there hadn't been that assassin's bullet in Ford's Theater that night, whether we might have had a different immediate future as well. Because with Lincoln's death, also died the commitment to Reconstruction that would be forgiving of ordinary Southerners, but that would have been determined that the laws that would grow up after Reconstruction failed, Jim Crow, I can't imagine that had Lincoln lived, we would have made as a country some of the compromises with the South that ended up keeping African Americans not enslaved, but oppressed for almost another 100 years.
Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to achieve and cherish a lasting peace among ourselves and with the world.
The Almighty has his own purposes. Let us judge not, that we be not judged. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, with malice toward none, with charity for all. These statements on their own are powerful, but understood as woven together by Lincoln in a tapestry of reconciliation out of the blood and suffering and death of the United States Civil War, leaves us clues about the American purpose and destiny, guiding us today and far into the future.
Yes, Lincoln is a 19th century person. He can't help us with climate change. But somehow he's one of those key people who I think speaks across time, across the years, and has much to say to us in the tumult of today's political culture.
We are thinking from the purview of today about the significance of a speech from early spring 1865. And what Lincoln was doing in early spring 1865 was thinking of notions that predated that speech by over 80 years. Lincoln himself is drawing from notions of old that gave to him a basis for the position that he had that day. And what was that position? That over a matter of time, God and country need revert back to the very basis upon which this experiment in democracy was established. And we are still bound by, we the people, bound by the notions that are being exclaimed and articulated by Lincoln on that day in 1865. Because what a democracy is at its best or worst, or maybe what our democracy is at its best or worst, is still a yet unreconciled, imperfect thing.
We hope you've enjoyed this production thus far, but there's more. You heard Condoleezza Rice eloquently discuss her thoughts on Lincoln's second inaugural. But please stay tuned because you are about to hear her and Jenny Oakes Baker play Free at Last medley. The point of the National Museum of American Religion is to create a space, be it virtual or brick and mortar, where important conversations about the role of freedom of religion in the United States of America can happen. We hope to provide educational programs. We hope to provide interesting historical presentations. And yet we also know that the role of music, film, novels contributes to what has happened in the past and what will happen in the future. Please join us in this exciting venture to figure out where do we go from here, where have we been, and how do we have that conversation with all relevant parties. Please join us and be a part of the National Museum of American Religion and donate today.